The morning began with a sharp metallic hum spreading across the training field as the holographic barrier dissolved and revealed the new exam terrain. It stretched for several kilometers, filled with dense vegetation, uneven ground, and a fast, glimmering river cutting straight through the middle like a liquid blade. Dozens of alien cadets gathered near the starting line, whispering nervously as the instructors walked forward, each carrying a sealed crate. Ethan Ward stood among them, relaxed, with his hands behind his back and his gaze calmly sweeping the landscape ahead. He already sensed something unusual about this trial, something that made the instructor's smug expressions even more noticeable. When the head instructor opened the crate and activated the exam rules, a glowing text appeared in mid-air. The announcement was short but brutal. Survival Trial, Phase 1, no tools allowed, bare hands only, violations result in immediate failure. The moment the message flashed, many cadets froze. A tall Valorian cadet let out a distressed clicking sound, clutching his sensory tendrils as if the idea of working without gear was unbearable. A reptilian Zarket cadet hissed in protest, complaining that her claws were only meant for climbing, not manipulating materials. One of the instructors silenced the murmurs with a dismissive wave before explaining the task in more detail. The cadets needed to move from the starting ridge to the observation plateau on the opposite side of the valley, where a checkpoint would confirm their arrival. No drones, scanners, or crafting devices were permitted. Even naturally grown biological tools, like retractable bone plates or venom spines, were forbidden. Everything had to be done with unassisted hands. Ethan watched the panic unfold around him and felt a faint, almost guilty amusement. He understood why many species trained with tools from childhood, relying on built-in devices or organic augmentations rather than developing physical skill through touch and force. But as he flexed his fingers, he felt something entirely different: readiness. He had grown up in a small rural town where broken fences, fallen branches, and storm damage were weekly challenges, and he had learned early to solve them with whatever he had, usually nothing but his own hands. While the aliens argued about how unreasonable the rules were, Ethan scanned the environment. The dirt was packed and slightly damp, which meant it would respond well to pressure if one needed to reshape it. The trees nearest to the ridge were tall but had fallen branches scattered around their roots. The river glittered in the sun, too wide to jump, too deep to wade through safely, and fast enough to drag someone downstream if he misjudged the current. Immediately after the river, he spotted a thick cluster of mud and reeds. That told him something important. The ground near the far bank was unstable. Anyone who crossed would need to think ahead or risk getting trapped waist-deep in the muck. The instructors gave the order to begin. Several alien cadets sprinted forward instantly, hoping to clear obstacles with pure speed. Others hesitated, trying to understand where the exam designers had placed invisible traps or how to bypass natural hazards without violating the no-tools rule. Ethan walked instead of running. He moved slowly enough to observe the terrain beneath his boots and memorize how the earth shifted under each step. The ground tilted sharply downward, and ahead of him the path became cluttered with fallen trunks. A group of 3 insectoid cadets tried lifting one of the heavy logs using their forelimbs, but the moment they applied pressure, the log slipped and crushed one cadet's mid-limb joint, forcing her to retreat with sharp, chattering cries. Ethan approached the pile, crouched beside the largest trunk, and pressed his palm against the rough bark. The wood was old and swollen with moisture. Heavy, but not immovable. He didn't try to lift it. Instead, he dug his heel into the dirt, leaned his shoulder into the trunk, and used controlled pressure to make it roll just a few inches. He repeated the motion, building momentum until the massive trunk began to move steadily, shifting into a new angle that opened a narrow path through the clutter. Behind him, the insectoid cadets stared in disbelief. Rolling instead of lifting had never crossed their minds. Ethan didn't stay long enough to explain. He continued forward, stepping over roots, clearing smaller branches from his way, and conserving his energy. He knew this exam wasn't just about crossing the terrain. It was about how efficiently each cadet could adapt. The instructors weren't testing strength or endurance alone. They were testing problem-solving instinct without external assistance. As he reached the riverbank, he noticed how several cadets had stopped completely. A pair of aquatic species considered swimming across, but the strong current discouraged them. A towering avian cadet tried gliding from a high rock but lost balance and plunged into the water, screaming as the current pulled him far downstream. Ethan crouched by the edge, dipped his hand into the river, and watched how the current tugged at his fingers. He felt the cold shock of the water, but also sensed its pattern. It flowed strongest near the center, weaker along the edges, and the river floor tilted downward toward one direction, useful information for later. But for now, he didn't attempt to cross. Instead, he stood and looked for what the other cadets had missed. The river wasn't the only obstacle. There was also the storm approaching from the west. He smelled the shift in the air before he even saw the clouds. Something metallic and sharp that told him the storm carried heavy ionization, typical of this region. That meant strong winds and possibly falling debris. The cadets had until midday to reach the plateau before the storm arrived. Ethan could already tell many wouldn't make it if they didn't adapt quickly. He closed his eyes for a moment, replaying a mental map of the terrain: fallen logs, river currents, unstable mud, and thick underbrush leading to the plateau. Every challenge he saw held a solution, but he also understood the order mattered. If he crossed too early, he would leave others behind and complicate his own progress on the far bank. If he waited too long, the storm would turn the river into a lethal torrent. He opened his eyes and took a slow breath, shifting his weight and stretching his fingers until they popped softly. His hands were already scratched from clearing the earlier path, but he welcomed the sensation. It grounded him. As the other cadets hesitated, blaming the rules and complaining that the challenge was unfair, Ethan stepped back from the river and walked a short distance along the bank. He studied the angle of the fallen trunks behind him. He measured the distance to the narrowest part of the river. He watched how the branches above cast shadows across the water. And then, quietly, without a word, he began forming a plan that used only what he had: his strength, his balance, his awareness, and his bare hands. It was still early morning, and lunch was hours away. But even before he built anything, even before lifting a single log or weaving a single root, the instructors noticed the shift in his posture. One whispered to another, pointing at Ethan. The human wasn't reacting to the challenge. He was preparing to solve it completely. And he would, long before anyone expected. Ethan stepped away from the riverbank and began walking parallel to the water, keeping his pace steady as he searched for the right location to start. The river was the largest obstacle between him and the plateau, but he wanted to handle it with precision instead of force. He didn't intend to make the mistake the other cadets had already made by trying to jump, glide, or brute force their way across. He wanted a crossing point that worked not just for him, but for anyone who came behind him. That was part of the challenge in his mind, showing that bare hands were more than weapons or tools. They were instruments of adaptation. The river widened in some places and narrowed in others, and he focused on the sections where the current looked weaker. The subtle change in watercolor told him where the riverbed was shallower. The blue-black streaks meant deep water and rapid movement, but the lighter green-tinted patches hinted at solid ground beneath. Beside him, several alien cadets watched with cautious curiosity. None dared step closer to the water after witnessing how easily the current could dominate even strong bodies. He didn't acknowledge their presence. His focus was on the flow, on the patterns, on the sound of the river slapping against its own banks. He was listening not for noise, but for structure. Eventually, he found a place where the river bent just slightly, creating a narrow channel between two natural outcroppings of rock. The path across would still be dangerous, but far less so than trying to swim in the wider section. Behind that point, the forest floor held several large trunks lying diagonally across the ridge, as though the last storm had purposely arranged them for a task. Ethan approached the nearest trunk and crouched down to examine it. The bark was thick, the inside heavy with water, and the long fibers that held the wood together still intact. That meant the trunk could support substantial weight. He pressed his shoulder against it and pushed. The trunk shifted slowly, rolling a few inches. A faint scrape of wood against soil echoed through the trees. Behind him, a short avian cadet gasped, startled by how easily Ethan moved something she had believed fixed in place. Ethan didn't offer any explanation. He planted his feet, corrected his angle, and pushed again. This time the trunk rolled farther. He kept the movement controlled, steady, letting gravity do the hardest part once the momentum caught. The trunk reached the edge of a shallow incline and stopped. Ethan wiped the dirt from his palms and scanned the area for the next trunk. The second one was longer, slightly thinner, and already leaning toward the slope. It would be far easier to maneuver, but it needed to be positioned precisely to interlock with the first trunk. He stepped behind it, crouched low, and nudged it forward using both hands placed near the base. The trunk slid along the damp soil. He guided its descent until it touched the first trunk. For a moment, both pieces rested at an odd angle. Ethan repositioned his stance, pressed his knee against the ground for support, and pushed upward just enough to allow the trunks to settle into a natural groove. The sound of wood locking into place gave him exactly what he wanted. 2 trunks were not enough for a stable crossing, but they formed the foundation. He inspected how they rested against the incline and the natural rock base on the opposite side. The structure wouldn't collapse, but it had gaps large enough to trap a foot or crumble under sudden pressure. The bridge had to be reinforced. He moved back into the forest, searching for roots thick enough to use as binders. Several roots wound across the forest floor like muscular vines, and he bent down to test their strength with a firm tug. The first few snapped easily. He rejected them instantly. The 5th root he tested held firm, resisting his pull with a deep stiffness that meant it had grown thick underground before becoming exposed. He grasped it with both hands and began pulling with slow, deliberate force. The fibers strained, then loosened, then finally separated from the earth. He dragged the root back toward the trunks. At the bridge site, 2 reptilian cadets waited near the edge, unsure if they should cross or help. One of them tilted her head in confusion as Ethan knelt beside the trunks and began weaving the root between them. She opened her mouth to ask what he was doing, but stopped when she saw the pattern. Ethan fed the root through the narrow gap between the trunks, looped it around, pulled it tight, and tied a knot using only the friction of bark and the pressure of his own fingers. Then he tied a second knot farther along. Each knot tightened naturally as the weight of the trunks held it in place. With the first reinforcement complete, he repeated the process twice more. He dragged 2 more thick roots from the forest floor. He wove them around the trunks, pressing his elbows and wrists into the wood to tighten each loop as firmly as possible. The alien cadets stared silently. None of them had considered that simple roots, when used intelligently, could become effective structural binders. When the last root was secured, Ethan stood and tested the bridge. He stepped onto the first trunk, letting his weight settle gradually. The wood creaked slightly but held. He walked across the structure, balancing easily as he moved toward the far bank. The trunks dipped only slightly from his pressure. When he reached the opposite side, he jumped lightly onto the rock outcropping and turned back. Several cadets cheered quietly, though most simply looked stunned. No one had been able to cross the river safely before him, and now the path stood open. A young insectoid cadet hesitated at the edge, clearly terrified of slipping or being swept downstream. Ethan met her gaze briefly and nodded once, encouraging her to try. She stepped onto the trunk, trembling, but made it across slowly while keeping her eyes fixed on the path. When she reached him, she whispered something in gratitude before hurrying to more solid ground. More cadets followed, each crossing with different levels of fear or confidence. Ethan remained nearby, ready to steady anyone who faltered, though he never touched anyone unless absolutely necessary. He let the bridge speak for itself. By the time the last cadet crossed, the instructors had already taken notice. They stood on the far hill, recording everything with silent astonishment. The human had taken what the forest provided, shaped it with nothing but his hands, and created the first major solution of the trial. Ethan didn't celebrate. He simply flexed his fingers again, feeling the sting of fresh scrapes and dirt embedded beneath his nails. The bridge behind him was solid, strong, and stable. It was also only the beginning. The swampy ground ahead suggested the next obstacle waited just beyond the trees. Ethan didn't slow down. He stepped into the undergrowth with the quiet confidence of someone whose mind was already working on the next challenge. Ethan stepped into the dense undergrowth beyond the river and immediately felt the shift in terrain. The ground no longer held the firmness of the ridge. Instead, it softened under his boots with each step, giving way in slow, sticky compressions. The air grew humid, heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and standing water. Thin mist hovered over the earth, clinging to the reeds and forming a wavering curtain that distorted the view ahead. It was obvious the area had flooded recently, leaving pools scattered like broken mirrors across the forest floor. The plateau remained far beyond this swamp-like stretch, and to reach it, he would need stability, not speed. A metallic buzzing disturbed the silence as several insectoid cadets approached from behind, stopping before the mud swallowed their steps. One of them tried walking around the puddles, only to sink knee-deep into the muck. Another attempted climbing a nearby tree to scout a route, but the branch snapped under her weight, dropping her back into the mud with a frustrated hiss. The swamp was not just an inconvenience, it was designed to trap anyone who underestimated it. Ethan crouched and pressed his palm against the wet soil. The mud vibrated faintly as water circulated beneath the surface, meaning the ground lacked any solid foundation. If he tried to walk through it, even he might get stuck or lose precious time. He stood and scanned the area, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtered through the tall reeds. He needed something buoyant, something capable of floating on shallow, uneven water while supporting weight. The forest offered no neat planks or ready-made debris, but he noticed how the storm had torn strips of bark from several thick trees, leaving them to curl and dry near the marsh's edge. Bark that had separated from the trunk naturally retained its buoyancy for a while, especially if it came from water-resistant trees. Ethan picked up the largest piece and pressed it under the surface of a puddle. It bobbed upward immediately, fighting the water. He smiled faintly. That was the first component. He searched the surrounding area for fallen branches and found several long, narrow limbs resting on the banks where the water had receded. Many were brittle, snapping easily under pressure, but a few retained their flexibility. Flexibility meant they had not yet dried out completely and would hold weight without breaking. Ethan tested one by pressing it against his knee and bending it slightly. It resisted with a smooth tension before returning to its original shape. Perfect. He collected the suitable branches, dragging them toward a shallow patch of mud that acted like a natural workbench. Next, he needed bindings. He scanned the marsh for vines. Near the base of a cluster of reeds, he found several strands that twisted together into thick cords. He grabbed one and tugged. It resisted but eventually pulled free. He tested its strength by looping it around both hands and pulling until the fibers squeaked. The vine held. He gathered several more, making sure each had enough flexibility to knot without snapping. When he returned to the branches and bark pieces, a reptilian cadet watched him with narrowed eyes, her tail flicking anxiously. She stood close enough for him to sense her curiosity, but far enough to keep the mud from reaching her boots. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then fell silent again. It didn't matter. Ethan understood her question simply from the way her gaze followed his movements. He began by arranging the bark pieces into flat layers, positioning the largest ones at the bottom and stacking lighter ones on top. He didn't need perfection. He needed a foundation that would float. Once the bark was stacked, he laid the flexible branches lengthwise across the top, forming a loose grid. The grid needed to be tight enough to keep the raft rigid, but not so tight that it lost buoyancy. With his knees in the mud and his hands pressing down on the branches, he wove the first vine through the structure. He fed it between a branch and a layer of bark, pulled it upward, crossed it over to the next branch, looped it underneath again, and repeated the motion. The vine creaked each time he tightened a knot, and his fingers burned from the friction, but he continued without hesitation. The reptilian cadet's eyes widened when she realized the raft was taking shape. Two other cadets approached, drawn by the quiet rhythmic sound of Ethan working. One, a small amphibian cadet with shimmering skin, leaned forward to inspect the raft and nearly slipped into the mud. Ethan extended his hand to steady her, and she grabbed it gratefully before taking a cautious step back. Her eyes sparkled with admiration, but she said nothing. She simply watched, curious and hesitant. Ethan tied the final knot at the back of the raft and pressed his palms against the structure. It held firm, the woven branches locking the bark into place. Still, he wanted reinforcement along the edges. He picked up two longer branches and bent them around the raft's perimeter, creating an outer frame. Using a combination of tension and strategic pressure, he fastened them to the grid with more vines. The raft began to resemble a sturdy platform, not beautiful, but unquestionably functional. He tested its buoyancy by sliding it into the nearest pool of water. It dipped for a moment as the weight settled, then floated, stable and level. He placed his boot on the edge and leaned his weight onto it. The raft sagged slightly but remained steady. Several cadets stared with open-mouthed disbelief. Without any tools, he had created a functional vessel. The reptilian cadet stepped closer, her voice finally breaking the silence. "Will it carry supplies?" she asked cautiously. Ethan nodded once. She hesitated again before revealing a small cache of training materials she had managed to keep dry by wrapping them in her cloak. She placed them gently onto the raft, expecting it to sink. It didn't. The raft settled deeper into the water but kept its balance. Ethan stepped into the puddle beside it, grabbed the edge, and pulled. The raft glided smoothly across the watery stretch. The cadets on the other side watched in stunned silence as he guided the raft to firm ground. He unloaded the supplies, then returned for more. His movements were efficient, almost rhythmic. Each crossing carried more items, packs, training modules, and personal belongings that cadets feared losing in the swamp. As he worked, the swamp grew noisier. Cadets whispered, pointed, or simply stared, unsure whether to feel impressed or humbled. Ethan didn't linger on their reactions. He continued ferrying until the area behind the swamp was clear of stranded cadets and abandoned gear. The reptilian cadet, the amphibian cadet, and even the quiet insectoid girl assisted him by arranging supplies on the far bank. He never instructed them to help. They simply followed his lead. Once the final crossing was complete, he lifted the raft from the water and set it on the dry ground. The structure, though soaked, remained intact. He wiped his hands on his pants, leaving smudges of mud and bark sap behind. The swamp now lay behind him, conquered through patience and precision rather than brute force. He glanced ahead. The forest grew darker farther in, and the sky above shifted with the restless movement of storm clouds. The instructors watched from a high vantage point, their expressions unreadable. But Ethan didn't need their approval. He had already begun thinking about the next obstacle, one that would require speed, intuition, and shelter before the storm arrived. Without resting, without waiting for the others, he stepped deeper into the forest. His hands were raw, scratched and sore, but still steady. The trial was far from over. The biggest challenge was coming. Ethan moved deeper into the forest, and with each step, the air around him grew heavier. The filtered light that had once flickered through the branches dimmed into a muted twilight, even though the sun had not yet reached its highest point. The forest canopy thickened overhead, and distant rumbles of thunder spread like ripples across the sky. The storm was coming faster than he anticipated. He could sense its pressure in the shift of wind and the earthy smell rising from the ground. If he didn't find a secure place soon, the downpour would turn the forest into an unpredictable maze of falling branches, flooding roots, and unstable slopes. He scanned the terrain for anything that could serve as a foundation for a shelter. The ground was uneven, sculpted by erosion and scattered with clusters of tall shrubs. Some of the shrubs bent under the growing wind, brushing against each other with soft rustles that sounded like whispers. He needed a location with natural support, something to anchor structure against gale-force winds. After walking several dozen meters, he spotted a grove where several slender trees grew in a semicircle. Their trunks arched outward slightly, as if pushed long ago by strong winds, forming a shallow natural alcove. It was perfect. The curved shape would deflect wind, and the spacing between the trunks was wide enough for a sizable shelter. He approached the nearest tree and pressed his hand against its bark. The tree was flexible, bending faintly under pressure, which meant its branches would also be pliable enough to shape without breaking instantly. The leaves around the grove had fallen in broad layers, and the soil at the base was soft, but not waterlogged. If he packed the soil tightly, it would harden enough to support a stable floor. He crouched and started by clearing the ground. Using his hands as scoops, he dragged layers of leaves aside and scraped away loose debris. Each movement left small cuts on his fingers where the sharp edges of twigs sliced across his skin, but he ignored the stinging sensation. Once the area was cleared, he pressed his palms flat against the soil and used the heel of his hand to compress it. He rhythmically hammered the ground, compacting it until it formed a firm, shallow indentation. The surface gradually hardened, forming a smooth base that would resist pooling water during the storm. With the floor prepared, he turned his attention to the frame. He stepped back to examine the natural curve of the trees again. Several branches hung low, weighed down by clusters of leaves. If he could bend them into an arch and secure them together, he would create a strong skeletal foundation. He chose a branch near the center of the grove and grasped it with both hands. He leaned his weight slowly against it, feeling how the wood resisted, then yielded. He did not force it abruptly. Instead, he added pressure in small increments until the branch dipped toward the ground without cracking. He held it in that position for a moment, letting the fibers adjust, then released it. The branch bounced back slightly, but retained part of the curved shape. Good. Bending the rest into place would be possible. He repeated this process with several other branches, gradually forming a dome-like outline. Some branches were naturally aligned with each other, while others required patient coaxing to bend without splitting. As he worked, the first droplets of rain began to fall, tapping lightly against the leaves with increasing frequency. He didn't have much time. Once the main branches bent inward to meet each other, he began binding them. He pulled down long strips of inner bark from nearby fallen trees, peeling them in thick ribbons. The bark resisted at first, clinging to the trunk, but eventually peeled away with a satisfying tear. He twisted the strips between his palms, rubbing them until the fibers softened and lengthened. The rain soaking through the forest canopy helped soften them even more, turning them into flexible cords. He tied the first branch to its partner by looping the cord around their crossing point, pulling tightly until the wood creaked in protest. He tightened the knot with both hands, bracing the branch with his forearm to keep it from snapping back. The cord held. Encouraged, he secured the next set of branches, working in a rough circle around the grove. Each knot bound the structure tighter and gave the dome a more defined shape. As the framework took form, several cadets approached cautiously. Among them was the amphibian cadet he had helped back at the swamp. She clutched her arms around herself as the rain began to fall harder, dripping from her smooth skin in rapid streams. A reptilian cadet accompanied her, her tail twitching uncomfortably from the cold. The cadets hovered near the trees, unsure whether to interrupt Ethan or simply watch. Ethan didn't speak. He continued working, signaling through his actions that he didn't need help, but also didn't mind the audience. The thunder cracked overhead, closer this time, prompting the cadets to step nearer. The amphibian girl shivered visibly. Her biological skin reacted poorly to cold rainfall, and each drop seemed to sap her energy. Ethan noticed her trembling but didn't comment. Instead, He sped up his movements, grabbing fallen leaves, large ones the size of his palm, and layering them over the frame. He wove the leaves like tiles, overlapping each one with the next. He used the natural curvature of the leaves to direct water away from the interior. After the first layer was complete, he added a second, then a third, weaving them tightly until the dome looked like a thick, layered shell. He pressed the final leaves into the structure, reinforcing them by tucking their stems beneath the cords that tied the branches. The rain intensified. Water cascaded down the dome, but not a single drop entered the interior. The cadets stared at the shelter as though witnessing an impossible transformation. Ethan stepped inside briefly to test it. The air beneath the dome felt warm, dry, and still. It was a pocket of calm in a rapidly darkening forest. When he stepped back out, the amphibian cadet hesitated before stepping closer. Her lips trembled as the cold overcame her, and she finally asked in a nearly voiceless tone, "May I go in?" Ethan nodded. She hurried inside, curling up near the center where the ground was driest. The reptilian cadet followed without asking, her scales already dull from the rain. One by one, more cadets arrived, soaked and exhausted. Some were trembling from cold, others from frustration. They stepped inside cautiously, unsure whether the shelter could hold all of them. Ethan watched them enter until the dome filled with bodies huddled close together. The warmth created from their combined presence built quickly, turning the shelter into a refuge rather than just a structure. He remained outside for a moment longer, checking the bindings and the position of the branches. The storm winds would be brutal, and any weak point could break the entire structure. He reinforced 2 knots and adjusted a branch that had shifted under the weight of the rain. Satisfied, he stepped inside the shelter last. The cadets moved aside to give him space, though no words were exchanged. The shelter resonated with the soft hum of rain hitting the layered leaves. Gusts of wind roared outside, but the dome held firm. No water dripped inside, no branch broke. The storm lashed the forest, bending trees and sending debris crashing through the underbrush, but the shelter remained unmoving, unmoved, almost defiant. The instructors observing from the distant plateau exchanged glances filled with disbelief. The challenge had not been designed for comfort or survival without tools, yet Ethan had created a sanctuary out of nothing but his hands and the raw materials of the forest. As the storm raged on, Ethan leaned back against the packed soil and rested his hands on his knees. His fingers throbbed from the effort, but he didn't mind. The cadets around him breathed quietly, soothed by the warmth and protected from the violent weather outside. For the first time since the trial began, the entire group experienced a moment of stability. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to prepare. The storm would pass. And when it did, the final part of the trial would begin. He knew he would be ready. When the storm finally softened into a distant rumble and the rain thinned into a gentle mist, Ethan opened his eyes. The interior of the shelter had warmed from the many bodies inside, and the humid air carried the scent of damp earth, leaves, and the strange metallic aftertaste left by ion-charged rain. Several cadets stirred weakly, stretching their limbs or rubbing the numbness from their fingers. The amphibian girl blinked slowly, relieved to feel warmth returning to her skin. The reptilian cadet flexed her tail, checking for stiffness from the cold. Everyone moved with the quiet exhaustion of individuals who had spent far too long bracing themselves against fear. Ethan shifted his weight and stood carefully, making sure his movement didn't disturb the branches supporting the dome. He leaned forward to peek outside. The forest glistened under the new calm, every leaf coated in the soft sheen of rainfall. Steam rose from the warmer soil, curling upward like miniature ghosts that vanished as soon as they reached the open air. He listened to the wind brushing lightly through the canopy. The violent gusts from earlier had faded into a peaceful breeze. He stepped out of the shelter, feeling the cool, damp ground beneath his boots. The storm had lasted longer than he had expected, and the morning hours were nearly gone. The sun hovered behind a thin layer of clouds, illuminating the forest in pale silver hues. He stretched his arms, wincing slightly at the soreness spreading through his shoulders. His hands were swollen from scraping wood and pulling vines, but his grip remained steady. There was still a final stretch of terrain between him and the plateau. The cadets emerged gradually, cautiously stepping outside and blinking in the soft daylight. Some looked around with disbelief, realizing the storm had spared them from harm because of the structure around them. A few whispered quietly to one another, casting glances at Ethan. Others approached him with hesitant gratitude, though none tried to speak more than necessary. There was a sense of reverence in the air, subtle yet unmistakable. Ethan nodded once to acknowledge their silent appreciation, then turned toward the high ridge in the distance. The plateau sat atop a steep incline covered with interwoven roots, slippery stones, and loose soil. During a dry day, the climb would require agility and balance. After a storm, it demanded precision and foresight. The ground would crumble under careless steps, and the roots, still slick from rain, could twist an ankle or send someone tumbling backward. He inhaled deeply. The instructors had not designed this final stretch to break cadets physically. It was meant to test judgment. Anyone rushing ahead would risk falling. Anyone hesitating too long would lose precious time before the evaluation window closed. He tightened the straps of his pack, wiped the last droplets of rain from his forehead, and began walking toward the incline. The first few meters were easy. The roots were thick, woven like a natural stairway. He stepped carefully, testing each foothold with a slight pressure before committing his full weight. The soil between the roots was soft, but the roots themselves held firm. As he climbed, he remained aware of the cadets behind him. Some followed his steps directly, mimicking his placement. Others chose adjacent paths, moving cautiously but steadily. Halfway up the incline, the terrain changed. The roots thinned out, replaced by uneven rocks that jutted outward at unpredictable angles. Water from the storm dripped between the cracks, forming small rivulets that trickled down the slope. Moss clung to the stones, making the surface dangerously slick. Ethan crouched low, placing his palms on the rock to feel its texture. The stone had a faint roughness beneath the moss. If he brushed sections of the moss away, he could create footholds with better traction. Using the edge of his palm and the tips of his fingers, he scraped away strips of moss. Each stroke revealed a patch of coarse stone beneath. He worked quickly, clearing a narrow vertical path. Behind him, a cadet hesitated before attempting the same. Ethan didn't look back, but he heard the relief in her breath when her foot found purchase on the cleaned stone. Ethan continued upward, clearing more footholds as he climbed. The incline steepened near the top, forcing him to shift his weight forward and cling to the stone with both hands. Several drops of water slid down his arms as he pulled himself upward, pressing his boots into the small crevices he had uncovered. When he reached the final ledge, he swung his leg over and hauled himself up onto level ground. The plateau stretched ahead of him, spacious and bright compared to the shadowed forest below. He rose to his feet and brushed mud from his palms. The cadets behind him reached the top one by one, some trembling, some panting, but all making it safely thanks to the footholds he had carved along the way. The reptilian cadet collapsed onto the ground beside him, her tail sprawled behind her as she tried to regain her breath. The amphibian girl knelt with her hands on her knees, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Before anyone could speak, a low hum echoed across the plateau. Holographic screens flickered into existence in a semicircle, each one displaying the emblem of the Galactic Academy. The instructors stepped forward, their boots leaving crisp impressions on the damp soil. Rainwater from their cloaks dripped rhythmically, but their expressions were unreadable. The head instructor, a broad-shouldered starborn woman with luminous patterns across her cheeks, approached Ethan first. She scanned him from head to toe, taking in his scraped hands, soaked clothes, and the steady, unshaken posture he held despite everything. Her voice, when she finally spoke, resonated with authority, yet carried a note of genuine astonishment. "Cadet Ethan Ward," she said, "your performance in this phase of the trial exceeded all expectations." She motioned toward the holographic record floating beside her. Images from the trial replayed. Ethan rolling trunks into position, weaving roots across the bridge, building the raft from bark and branches, crafting the shelter, clearing footholds up the incline. The footage displayed not just his skill, but his composure. Even under storm conditions, his movements had remained focused and deliberate. He had not panicked. He had not hesitated. He had simply adapted. "During the hands-only test," the instructor continued, "you completed every major obstacle before the designated midpoint of the evaluation window. Additionally, your solutions were structurally sound enough to support other cadets, enabling several species, many of whom struggled with the terrain, to reach the checkpoint safely." A soft murmur spread across the plateau as the other instructors reviewed the footage. Some nodded with approval. Others looked genuinely startled. A few seemed almost embarrassed to realize how thoroughly they had underestimated him. The head instructor then turned to the group of cadets who had followed Ethan. "Each of you owes your survival and timely arrival to his intuitive problem-solving and decisive action. This trial is not designed to reward brute strength, but to test adaptability, ingenuity, and the ability to create solutions where none appear possible." She paused, letting the words settle. The human has demonstrated all three with exceptional proficiency. Ethan shifted uncomfortably under the praise. He had not acted for recognition. He had built the bridge because it needed to be built. He had made the raft because it was the only logical way forward. He had created the shelter because it was necessary. The idea of receiving attention for doing what felt natural left him feeling strangely exposed. Yet he met the instructor's gaze steadily, acknowledging her words without bowing to them. The head instructor gestured once more, finalizing the evaluation. "This concludes Phase 1 of the Galactic Survival Examination. Cadet Ethan Ward, your results will be recorded as exemplary. You have redefined the parameters of the hands-only challenge." Ethan nodded. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Not pride, but quiet satisfaction. He looked at his hands, still raw, scratched, and dirt-streaked. Those hands had solved every problem placed before him, without tools, without shortcuts, without hesitation. He took a slow breath, letting the cool plateau air fill his lungs. The cadets around him straightened their posture, energized by the unexpected turn of the exam. The storm had passed, the forest had quieted, and the plateau stood bathed in soft silver light. Ethan looked toward the horizon, where distant mountain peaks rose like jagged silhouettes against the thinning clouds. This trial was only one step in a much larger journey. More challenges would come, some harsher, some stranger, some that would demand even more from his body and mind. But for now, he allowed himself one rare moment of stillness. He had done what he came to do. And as the last echoes of thunder dissolved into silence, Ethan stepped forward with the calm confidence of someone who had already proven what he was capable of, with nothing more than his hands.